Hello, I'm Chris Proctor. I'm a weed science extension educator at the University of Nebraska. I'm going to talk a little bit today on some broadleaf weed seedling identification. Thinking about weed identification, why does it even matter? When we talk about controlling weeds, there's a few things that we like to think about, weed size being one of them. And so I often like to show this poster here. When we talk about weed size, we always say, if your weeds are larger than a 12-ounce soda can, they're getting too big to control. So we really want to catch them when they're early. That gives us the best, really the best opportunity to control those weeds when they're small. Our herbicides are more effective when they're small. And so that's really important. But, it's great to be able to control weeds when they're small. But that also means we want to think about identifying them when they're small. And so seedling identification, I think, is really important, but it's also a lot more challenging. And so there's a lot of resources out there in terms of seedling identification. I got a couple on the screen. There's a number of different weed seedling identification type guides out there, pocket books that show just pictures of weed seedlings and kind of walk you through different characteristics of weed seedlings. And so that can be really helpful in terms of identifying seedlings. So again, if we can catch them when they're small, if we're scouting weeds when they're small, and we can identify them, it really helps be able to manage them more effectively, because we know that there's certain herbicides that are more effective than others on certain types of weed species. At Nebraska, and I know a lot of different institutions put resources like this together, but we have a guide for weed disease insect management. I was just going to highlight in here, and I won't go into great detail, but we've put together a lot of tables, these efficacy tables. So these are a number of different herbicides and how effective they are at controlling different species of weeds. And we just give different ratings for control. And so all that to say, some herbicides are going to control certain weed species more effectively than others. So it helps to know what weeds we have in the field as we go and design our management programs and our herbicide programs. And so identification can be a really important component of a management plan when thinking about our cropping systems. And so again, identifying weed seedlings is really critical, because we want to catch weeds when they're small, but also knowing what we have in our field, the different biologies of the different weeds, and when they like to emerge, and understanding all those types of things can be really critical in terms of being successful in terms of weed management. So when we talk about broadleaf weed identification, I usually like to start by thinking about the life cycle of different weeds. And so there's different plants have different life cycles. One particular life cycle that a lot of weeds fall into in our cropping systems are annual weeds. So these would complete their life cycle in about 12 months. They often reproduce, or primarily reproduce by seed, and they're classified as both winter annuals and summer annuals. And so a winter annual would germinate in the fall. It would start its growth and then tend to go dormant over the winter time. And then in the spring, as temperatures warm back up, that weed will begin its growth again, and it will complete its life cycle relatively early in that year, setting seed and reproducing. Whereas a summer annual tends to germinate early in the spring, again, as temperatures begin to warm up, and then it'll grow through the season, and it'll tend to set seed later in the year as we get closer to late summer, early fall. Summer annuals tend to reproduce, and so those different life cycles can affect how those weeds compete in our different cropping systems, and we would give some thought in terms of how we might control those different weeds of different life cycles. Another life cycle would be a biennial, and so this is a plant that completes its life cycle over 2 seasons. So the first season, it'll emerge and be vegetative the first year, usually forming these rosettes, and that's an ideal time to control a biennial. And then the second year, it'll bolt, or it'll send up a reproductive stem and produce seed in that second year. And it's often more difficult to control those weeds once they enter that reproductive stage. And then we also have perennial weeds. And so these are weeds that have multiple year life cycle. Often they're vegetative that first year, then they may reproduce in the second and subsequent years. They tend to have a more extensive root system. They'll often reproduce not only by seed, but also very commonly by other means, by rhizomes, stolons. You can see here in the picture I have, this would be a Johnson grass plant, and you can see this rhizome, this underground stem that grows. You can see that it's producing some roots, and so new plants will actually come up from these different nodes on the rhizome, and so it'll spread and reproduce by the rhizome. So when we talk about broadleaf plants, that's a broad category of plants. Another term for broadleaf plants would be dicots, and so these are plants that have cotyledons. So you have two cotyledons, and then they'll often have, after the cotyledons emerge, then the true leaves begin to emerge on that plant. Sometimes the first set of true leaves is distinct or different than the subsequent true leaves that will emerge on certain plants. So here's a picture of a soybean plant. This is one that we're all most likely familiar with, and you can see in this picture here, here's the cotyledon. So that's that first part of the seed that emerges. You can see the cotyledon here emerging from the soil as that soybean plant emerges. And so the reason I'm highlighting the cotyledons, one is it's unique to broadleaf plants, but two, it's something that we can use in terms of identification. So I'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a moment. I'm going to zoom back just a little bit, though. When we think about broadleaf weed identification, understanding the morphology or the different plant parts and maybe how to classify them, what they are, it can be really helpful in terms of identification. So if we understand all the different types of parts that can be present on a broadleaf plant and the type of variation that we might see depending on the plant we're looking at, that can help us distinguish one plant from another. And so I'm going to go into some of these different plant parts in a little bit more detail here. So let me start here again with the cotyledon. So I just mentioned that with soybean, but when we're talking about weed seedlings, the cotyledon can be one of the most useful things we have in terms of seedling identification. So a lot of broadleaf plants have distinct cotyledons or unique cotyledons, and that can help us differentiate different types of broadleaf plants. And so here I have two different examples of cotyledon shapes. So linear lanceolate, so those are kind of long, narrow cotyledons, and you can see on this water hemp plant here, here's the two cotyledons, kind of that linear shape. Whereas on this velvet leaf plant below, you can see we have more of these round cotyledons. And so that's one way we can differentiate that. A couple of different examples here. So here's kind of an ovate shaped cotyledon on this chickweed plant. And then on this giant ragweed plant here on the right, you can see more of an oval or almost spatulate shaped cotyledon. So again, just different types of cotyledons that can be useful to distinguish these seedlings as they're emerging. Again, I'll show just one or two more examples here. So a kidney-shaped cotyledon on this field bindweed plant as it's emerging. And so that can be a distinguishing factor. You can see, a lot of these other plant features are so small, it's often hard to tell them apart when they're small. And so these cotyledons, again, are really useful characteristic to distinguish. And when we look at the morning glories, they have really distinct cotyledons. So this pitted morning glory plant has this really distinct butterfly-shaped cotyledon here, and so that's one of the unique features that kind of helps identify the morning glory plants. I'm going to shift here away from talking about cotyledons for a second and just think about the true leaves and how they might differentiate, because that can be useful in terms of identifying different plants. And so you can have different shaped leaves. So we have a simple leaf. So this whole structure here is a leaf versus a pinnately compound leaf. So this whole thing here is a leaf, and then we have individual leaflets. And then we have a palmately compound leaf here. So pinnately, often you think of a feather. So you have the main stem of a feather, and then all the feathers that come off of that. Or a palm, this is more like a person's hand, right, with the fingers all originating from the same place, where those terms would come from. And so if we look at a plant like this, so this is puncture vine here. This is a great example of pinnately compound leaf. So again, this whole structure here is the leaf, and you can see all these different leaflets on the plant there. Leaf margin can be another really helpful characteristic to distinguish from different types of plants. And so when we look at different plants and their leaves, they'll have different shapes or edges there on the leaves themselves. And so this can be a really useful way to differentiate between plants. And so a lot of broadleaf weed identification is identifying different characteristics that help us separate one plant from another, and starting to put plants into different categories. And this is what makes broadleaf, or it's usually the process that we go through when we're thinking about broadleaf weed identification. And so here would be an example of a common milkweed, and you can see, this would be a kind of a smooth margin on this leaf here. And so that might be a characteristic that we can use early on to begin to differentiate this from other types of plants that have more serrated leaf edges, for example. This is one, and some of the more difficult to distinguish species, this can be a really helpful characteristic. So leaf position. So where do the leaves originate from on the stem of the plant? And so really there's two options. If we think of the node on the stem as the place where those leaves originate from, we can have plants that have leaves that are opposite. So they're coming from the same place on the stem, the same node, but they come out on opposite sides of the stem. Or we could have what's called an alternate leaf arrangement. And so you have the nodes are staggered on the stem. So you have one leaf that's down below, and it emerges on one side of the stem, and then the stem grows a little bit, and you have the next node, and a single leaf emerges on the opposite side of that stem. And so a great example here would be milkweed. And if you look at this, you have leaves that are approximately the same size on exactly the opposite side of the plant. And so you have a leaf here on one side of the plant and a pretty much similar sized leaf on the other side of the plant. That would suggest that this is an opposite arrangement. So that would be a characteristic you could use to identify this plant. Here's another great example of opposite leaf arrangement. This common ragweed plant here, or giant. I said it right the first time. See, here we go. See, they're easy to confuse. But again, if you look at the stem here and the nodes, you see that the leaves are coming out at the exact same place on that stem. And so this would be an opposite arrangement. There's a few instances where you have plants that begin with opposite arrangement. So the early emerging leaves would be opposite, but then as that plant matures and that stem begins to elongate, then it actually switches to alternate arrangement. And so this common ragweed plant here is a great example of that. So the early emerging leaves would be opposite, and then as it grows, you see that it switches to alternate arrangement. And then here's another good example of alternate. And so you can see here on this pigweed plant, this palmer plant, these leaves as they're emerging are pretty distinctly different sizes. So that would suggest that they're emerging at different times. So that's one key that you can look at. But then if you can actually see the stem, you can see here you got a leaf emerging here, then the stem grows a little bit. The next one emerges on the other side, and then it alternates back to the other side. And so this would be alternate arrangement. So again, this can be a helpful characteristic for identifying some broadleaf plants. Here's another characteristic that's unique to a certain family of plants. So this is called an ochrea. And so this is almost like an onion skin-like sheath that occurs on in the buckwheat family or Polygonaceae family. And so you can see that arrow pointing to this leaf, this ochrea here that's on the stem, right around the leaf node. And it's a really papery thin sheath that kind of wraps itself around the stem. And so, it's within the buckwheat family. So wild buckwheat, Pennsylvania smartweed, for example, are plants that would have this ochrea. And so if you find that on the plant, that helps narrow down to at least the specific family. And so that's a good identifying characteristic. let me shift here just a little bit and talk about another a tool that can be used for identifying broadleaf weeds. So a dichotomous key is a tool that if you don't know where to start, this is a tool that you can use to kind of work your way through a process in terms of identifying a broadleaf or grass weed, but we're going to talk about using it for identifying broadleaf weeds here. And so first, it's going to walk you through the cotyledon shape. So that's the first. So usually this would be, again, we're focused on seedling identification. Certainly as a plant gets up to a certain size, the cotyledons oftentimes will fall off, or you won't be able to find them anymore. And so this wouldn't be as useful for larger plants, but then usually it has more distinguishing characteristics as it gets larger. So start with the cotyledon. So if we look at that picture on the left, we can see that this would have that linear or lancelet type cotyledon. And so we're gonna begin our way down the key this way. The next question that the key then asks us are the first true leaves alternate or opposite? Well, we answered that question and said that these are alternate leaves, so they're emerging at different times, and so it's gonna continue us down through the key. The next question: is there an ochrea present? Yes or no? And so in this case, we're gonna say no. There's no ochrea present. And so now it's going to ask, the key is going to say, all right, does this plant have large cotyledons with prominent recessed midvein? And in this case, if you're able to see that picture really up close, you'd say no, it doesn't have a really large cotyledon. And so it's going to take us over to this next question. Is there a nick in the tip of the first true leaf, and are the stems reddish violet? And so if we look at the tip of this leaf, you see just a little indent on the end of that leaf. And so now this has kind of led us all the way down to, it looks like this is a pigweed species. And so you can see, using a key kind of walks you through a process, a series of yes or no questions. They're going to lead you on one path or the other. And the hope is it's going to get you at least down to a species level. And so then it's going to key it out beyond that. So it's going to say, here are some different pigweed species. Let's see if we can distinguish that between that. And so when we look at the stem and the leaves, are they smooth or hairy, rough or glossy? What's the leaf shape? And so the question now becomes, well, how do you distinguish between similar species? So the pigweeds are often a challenging couple of weeds to distinguish from each other. And so when you look at the difference between redroot pigweed, common water hemp, and Palmer amaranth, how do you distinguish those? Well, redroot pigweed, it has a hairy stem, and so it's of those three, it's the only one that's going to have hairs on the stem, and so that's one of the easy ways to distinguish a redroot pigweed from those other two. And then when you look at the difference between, say, common water hemp and Palmer amaranth, leaf shape can certainly play a role here. So water hemp often has narrower leaves than Palmer has more of these almost egg-shaped leaves. When you look down on top of a water hemp plant, you can see a lot of gaps as you look at how the leaves are arranged around the stem relative to a Palmer plant. Has a lot more leaves kind of filling in those gaps, and so it has a denser canopy. And then the last thing that's helpful, a characteristic that is often used, is if you take the leaf and the petiole and pick it off that plant, off that stem, and you were to fold the leaf back over top of the petiole, if the leaf petiole is shorter than the leaf, that would be a water hemp plant. Whereas the petiole, if the petiole is at least as long as the leaf when you fold it back on top of itself, or longer than the leaf, that's typically a Palmer plant. And so as you get down to the species level, you have to start looking for these differentiating factors. That you have plants that at first glance look very similar, but upon closer inspection, you can see that there's some things that we can use to differentiate one plant for another. And so here's kind of an overview of one of those keys. And sometimes you get to the end of the key and you say, well, one of the weeds that I'm looking for just doesn't seem to be here. Often they'll give alternative weeds that also could have keyed out to that same location. And so sometimes you can check, you can look in these boxes that are at the end of the key, and that'll help kind of give you a few more options to identify those weeds. If you don't see it there, obvious at the end of the key. And so again, that's just another tool to use when identifying seedlings. It can be a helpful thing to at least narrow you down and get you closer to the mark. So thinking about broadleaf identification, I think it's really important to identify weeds when they're small, be out there scouting when they're small so that you can see what you have in the field and be able to do something about it in a timely manner before they get too big and become much more challenging to control. And just understanding the different life cycles of these weeds and the biologies. And then really start thinking about what are the different characteristics of these weeds that I can use to differentiate them from each other. And so, this was kind of an overview of broadleaf weed identification. It would be helpful maybe at another time to go into more detail and to talk more specifically about certain weeds and how do we differentiate certain weeds one from another. So I think that would kind of be the next step in thinking about broadleaf weed identification. But with that, I'm going to end this presentation at this point. I certainly welcome any feedback or follow-up if you have questions. You want some help thinking through this in the upcoming growing seasons. I'd be happy to discuss this further. And so I have some of my contact information here on this screen. You can reach out to me by email, phone, or otherwise, and I would just welcome those conversations. Thank you.